The gavel came down at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, and the sound it made was not dramatic. It was small, almost apologetic, a wooden knock against a wooden block in a room that had heard 10,000 verdicts before this one and would hear 10,000 more. The marble floors of the Supreme Court of New York did not amplify it. The fluorescent lights did not flicker. The 37 journalists packed into the gallery did not gasp. They had expected a scene. The tabloids had promised one. For 8 months, the dissolution of the Ashford marriage had been the preferred entertainment of anyone with a subscription to the financial press. Grant Ashford, founder and CEO of Ashford Holdings, a man whose net worth the Wall Street Journal had most recently estimated at $4.3 billion, was divorcing his wife of 10 years under circumstances that his legal team had worked very hard to make look clean and very hard to make look inevitable. The psychological evaluation commissioned by his attorneys had described Nora Calloway Ashford as emotionally volatile, prone to paranoid ideation, and unsuited to the pressures of life at the intersection of public scrutiny and private wealth. The prenuptial agreement, drafted by the firm of Bellworth and Crane and reviewed by 3 separate judges over the preceding 14 months, had been ruled enforceable in its entirety. The house in Greenwich, the apartment on the Upper West Side, the jointly held positions in 4 charitable foundations, including the Walter Calloway Memorial Fund, which bore her father's name. All of it went to Grant. The journalists had their cameras ready. A photographer from the Post had positioned himself at the precise angle that would catch Nora's face at the moment of impact. A blogger who covered the social lives of New York's financial elite had already drafted the first 3 paragraphs of her piece, leaving only the emotional centerpiece blank, that one image, that one crumbling expression that would confirm the narrative everyone had agreed upon in advance. Nora Calloway. Ashford gave them nothing. She stood at the defendant's table in a gray wool dress that had cost less than the parking validation her attorneys had submitted for reimbursement. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her hands were clasped in front of her at the precise midpoint between relaxed and formal. Judge Harold Fenwick, whose eyeglasses had slid to the very end of his nose over the course of the morning's proceedings, looked up from his papers and asked, as procedure required, whether the defendant wished to make any statement before the judgment was finalized. The room compressed. 37 journalists held their breath. Grant Ashford, seated at the plaintiff's table in a suit the color of deep water, allowed himself the smallest adjustment of his cufflinks. "No, Your Honor." Nora's voice was level and clear, the kind of voice that carried without effort. "The judgment is acceptable." The confusion in the gallery was audible even without any specific sound, a collective shift, a recalibration. The particular silence of people who had braced for impact and found nothing to brace against. Fenwick looked at her over his slipping glasses for a moment that stretched 2 seconds past comfortable. Then he brought the gavel down again, said the words that ended it, and the room dissolved into the controlled chaos of an occasion that had somehow failed to become the occasion it was supposed to be. Grant Ashford crossed the 20 feet of marble floor between the plaintiff's table and where Nora stood gathering a single manila folder from in front of her. His attorney, Douglas Bellworth, 62 years old and meticulous as a Swiss movement, remained 3 steps behind. Grant moved the way men move when they have won something and are deciding whether to be magnanimous about it. "You made the right call." His voice was low enough that only she could hear it, and he had positioned himself so that his back was to the cameras, eliminating any possibility of lip readers in the gallery. He smelled of the cedar and bergamot cologne he had worn for the last decade, the one she had bought him from a shop in Midtown during the first year of their marriage, when buying him things had still felt like an expression of something real. "The NDA is comprehensive. Anything about the Calloway acquisition, anything about the ledger filing, you know what happens. We've been through this." Nora looked at his tie. A charcoal silk with a diagonal grain, chosen no doubt by someone on his communications team to convey measured authority for the cameras outside. She had not chosen it. She had stopped choosing his clothes 4 years ago, around the same time she had stopped being consulted on anything. "Enjoy it, Grant." She picked up her folder. "You've earned a moment." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite doubt, not quite suspicion, but a cousin of both. He had scripted this differently in his mind. He had scripted her as undone. The prenuptial agreement was airtight. The psychological evaluation had been thorough. He had removed her from every board, every filing, every public record that connected the name Calloway to the system that bore her father's name. He had done everything correctly, and the woman standing in front of him looked like someone who had just finished an errand. "Don't make this complicated," he said. "I'm not making anything." She moved toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. "You did all the work." She was aware of the cameras the moment she stepped into the corridor. The half-dozen photographers who had not been granted courtroom access and had arranged themselves along the marble hall in the way that photographers arrange themselves when they believe they are about to capture something significant. She walked past them without variation in her pace. A reporter from the financial desk of the Tribune pushed a recorder toward her face and asked whether she had any comment on the ruling, whether it was true she had attempted to contest the ledger patent independently, whether she intended to appeal. "No comment," she said, and kept walking. She pushed through the glass doors at the end of the corridor and stepped out into the October air, which was cold and clean and entirely indifferent to the verdict that had just been handed down. The courthouse steps fell away in broad gray slabs toward the street below, where a yellow cab was already pulling to the curb as though she had called it, which she had 3 days ago when she had confirmed the date of the verdict and made certain arrangements. She descended the steps at the same measured pace. In the interior pocket of her gray dress, her right hand found the edge of a manila envelope without looking. Her fingers rested against it for just a moment, a small private confirmation, and then she let go. The cab pulled away from the curb, and the cameras on the courthouse steps captured a woman who looked to every observer like someone who had just lost everything that mattered. She was calculating. The workshop had been on the property for longer than the house. Walter Calloway had built it himself in the summer of 1987, the year before Nora was born, in the backyard of the house in Westchester where she had grown up. It was a low, wide structure with a corrugated metal roof and walls that her father had insulated himself against both temperature and sound because he was the kind of man who believed that the only thing worse than thinking slowly was thinking loudly. He had kept his best work there. Not the consulting contracts, not the government filings, not the presentations for clients whose names she had not been permitted to know until she was old enough to understand the weight of discretion. The real work, the foundational work, the work that a man does at 2 a.m. when the rest of the world has gone quiet and the problem has been waiting patiently for exactly this level of attention. Nora had her first coding lesson at that workbench when she was 9 years old. Walter had set a cup of hot chocolate at her elbow, pulled a second stool alongside his, and said, "Architecture is just logic made physical. Everything else is decoration." He had meant it about buildings. He had also meant it about software. He had also meant it about people, though it took her another decade to understand that part. She thought about this in the back of the cab as Manhattan gave way to the outer boroughs, the skyline flattening and widening, the morning light moving across the rooftops of Queens in the particular way it did in October, low and honest, without the softening effect of summer haze. She thought about her father's hands on the keyboard, about the way he had built Ledger not as a product but as a philosophy, a system designed at its root to make concealment expensive. Every anomaly documented, every discrepancy flagged, every attempt to move money through channels that were not supposed to exist recorded and time-stamped and stored in a place that the person attempting the concealment would not think to look. He had been proud of it in the specific restrained way that precise men are proud of precise things. He had never told her it was revolutionary. He had told her it was correct, which for Walter Calloway was the higher compliment. Grant had understood the value of Ledger within 18 months of joining the Calloway Financial Systems Board. Nora had watched him understand it, had watched the gradual shift from attentive investor to something more acquisitive, the way his questions in board meetings moved from strategic to structural, the way he began to ask with increasing specificity about the architecture of the system rather than its commercial applications. At the time, she had been 31 years old, and in the early years of a marriage that still felt like it might become something she had intended it to be. She had told herself she was reading him wrong. She had told herself that a man who asked precise questions about software architecture was simply a man who had done his homework. She had been wrong about what he was doing with the homework. The cab stopped on a residential block in Queens in front of a narrow 3-story building sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a physical therapy practice. Nora paid in cash. She had been paying in cash for 6 months, a habit she had developed incrementally and without announcement, and let herself into the building with a key she had cut from a copy she had never registered. The apartment on the second floor had been leased under her maiden name Calloway, which was a name that appeared nowhere in the divorce proceedings because Grant's legal team had not thought to look for it, having assumed that a woman who had gone by Ashford for 10 years had no particular attachment to the name she had carried for 32 years before that. This was the kind of assumption that cost people everything. The apartment was small and smelled faintly of fresh paint over something older. She had furnished it minimally and functionally: a desk, a chair, a bed. She had not slept in more than 3 hours at a stretch in the past week. A small kitchen table where she had spread and respread the contents of the manila envelope so many times over the past 72 hours that the paper had begun to soften at the folds. She set her bag down, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. The document in the envelope was a notarized transfer of ownership. She had found it 3 days ago. She had been at her father's workshop, the one in Westchester that Grant had not bothered to include in the asset schedule because the property had been transferred to a separate family trust before the marriage, and because a workshop full of 20-year-old hardware and hand-labeled file boxes did not strike the attorneys at Bellworth and Crane as a significant asset. She had gone there for reasons she could not entirely articulate, the way a person sometimes goes to a place where someone they loved used to be, not expecting to find them, but finding something anyway. She had been clearing the bottom drawer of the old workbench, the one her father had built into the wall below the east window, when her hand found the lip of tape on the underside of the false drawer bottom, a modification she had not known. He had made a small concealed space no wider than a standard manila envelope. Inside, a single document notarized by a New York State notary public at 7:43 in the morning on the date that Walter Calloway had been admitted to Mercy General Hospital with what the attending physician had recorded as a spontaneous subarachnoid hemorrhage. The transfer named two parties as joint holders of all intellectual property rights associated with the ledger system and its derivative architectures: Walter James Calloway and Nora Marie Calloway. Not Nora Ashford, Nora Calloway. Her father had signed it the morning he died. He had signed it before he drove to the courthouse where he was expected to testify before a federal grand jury. He had signed it and hidden it in the one place he believed she would eventually look, not today, not this year, but someday when she needed it, and then he had gotten into his car and driven toward a courthouse he never reached. She had sat on the workshop floor for a long time with the document in her hands. Then she had stood up, called the number she had been given 3 months earlier by a woman she had met at a conference for mid-sized financial technology firms, and said 4 words: "I found the key." Fletcher Oakes appeared at her door at 10:40 that night. He was 57 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had once been physically imposing and had not entirely surrendered the architecture of it. Though the years and a particular kind of sustained stress had worn grooves into his face that had not been there when Nora had last seen him at a Callaway board meeting 7 years ago. He wore a dark jacket over a flannel shirt and carried a hard drive in a Ziploc bag, the way a man carries something he does not want to explain if stopped. She had not expected him. She looked through the peephole for a full 5 seconds before she opened the door, and even then she opened it only as far as the chain allowed. "You're the last person I expected." It was not an invitation. It was an observation delivered through a 3-inch gap. Fletcher's expression did not change. "You're the hardest person to find in a borough of 2.3 million people." He held up the hard drive. "I have the internal security logs from the Callaway Financial Building, the night your father was admitted to the hospital. Grant had the originals pulled and formatted 18 months ago. He didn't know I'd kept a mirror backup on a personal server. He didn't know because he fired me before he thought to check." She studied him through the gap for another moment. Then she released the chain and opened the door. Fletcher came in and stood in the middle of the small apartment with the careful stillness of a man who understood that he was a guest in a space that belonged entirely to someone else's planning. He looked at the kitchen table, at the manila envelope, at the single mug on the counter. He did not comment on any of it. "Why now?" Nora asked. It was not really a question. She moved to the kitchen and poured a second mug of coffee without asking whether he wanted one, because men who showed up at nearly 11 at night with evidence drives had already made their position clear on the subject of inconvenience. "Because of Tessa Marlowe." Fletcher sat down in the chair she indicated. "She's not his girlfriend. She's not a distraction. She's the person who designed the acquisition structure. Grant is the signature on everything. She's the architecture. And they're closing in 12 days the full transfer of the ledger patent and all derivative rights to Ashford Holdings, which then flips the whole package to a private equity consortium she's been building for 3 years. He set the hard drive on the table beside the manila envelope. "Once that closes, the patent is buried inside a holding structure with 7 layers of corporate insulation. You'll never reach it from outside." Nora sat down across from him. She looked at the hard drive, then at the transfer document, then at the man who had shown up at her door with pieces of a picture she had been assembling for 6 months. "There's something I need to tell you," Fletcher said. His voice had changed not in volume, but in register, the way a voice changes when it moves from the professional into the personal. That specific tonal shift that means what follows is not strategic information, but something older and harder. "My daughter, Renata. She was a CPA working internal audit at Ashford Holdings. 4 years ago, she identified a pattern of anomalous transfers consistent with the kind of off-book routing that Ledger was originally designed to detect. She reported it internally through the compliance channel because that's what you're supposed to do." He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment. The compliance officer reported directly to Grant. Within 6 weeks, documentation was produced showing performance deficiencies that didn't exist. Her contract was terminated. Then a formal complaint was filed with the state licensing board, fabricated every word of it, and she lost her CPA certification. He looked up. "She's been working as a bookkeeper for a landscaping company in New Jersey for 3 years. She's 31 years old, and she did everything right, and he destroyed her for it." The apartment was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street below its headlights, sweeping briefly across the ceiling. "So, you're not here for abstract justice," Nora said. "I'm here because you're the only person who has standing evidence and motive in the same room." Fletcher's voice had returned to its previous register. Precise, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years managing other people's complications and had learned that emotional clarity was a professional asset. "And because I've been watching you for 2 years, and you're the only person in this entire situation who actually understood what your father built." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the inside pocket of the gray dress she had worn to court that morning. She had not changed, had not had any particular reason to, and placed a second document on the table beside the first. This was the journal entry. She had copied it by hand onto a fresh sheet of paper because she did not want to risk the original outside the workshop, and because the act of transcribing it had forced her to sit with each word at the pace of handwriting rather than reading, which was how her father had taught her to think about things that mattered. The entry was dated 12 years ago, the evening before the morning he had driven toward the federal courthouse. The handwriting was her father's compact architectural. Each letter formed with the precision of a man who had drafted circuit diagrams by hand before drafting software by keyboard. She slid it across the table so Fletcher could read it. He read slowly. When he finished, he read it again. He knew Grant was moving to bury the evidence. Fletcher's voice was careful now, the way a person is careful when they are holding something fragile. He wasn't going to testify about a financial irregularity. He was going to testify about 11 years of systematic securities fraud. Nora's voice was even. She had had 72 hours with this information, and she had moved through the stages that most people move through. Disbelief, grief, the cold, particular rage of someone who has been lied to on a scale that requires a complete reconstruction of the past, and had arrived by the night of the verdict at something that was not peace, but was the next useful thing, clarity. Grant knew Ledger had been running in background mode since my father installed it. It was logging every anomalous transaction in the Ashford Holdings ecosystem. Grant needed 2 things: the patent so he could shut down the system and control what happened to the logs, and my silence so I wouldn't go looking for what the logs contained. She looked at Fletcher across the kitchen table. He wasn't divorcing me because he wanted Tessa Marlowe. He was divorcing me because he couldn't find the kill switch, and he decided that if he removed me from every legal structure associated with Callaway Financial Systems, I wouldn't have standing to look for it either. Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. "And now you have the transfer document." "Now I have the transfer document." "Which means you and your father jointly held the patent the entire time. Which means every filing Grant made claiming sole ownership was fraudulent from the day it was signed." Nora looked at her coffee. It had gone cold. She did not reach for it. "He spent 8 years building a fraud on a foundation that was never his to build on." The television in the apartment above them murmured through the ceiling, the indistinct sound of late-night news or a talk show, someone else's carefully managed reality. Fletcher turned the hard drive over in his hands, looking at it the way people look at things they have been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. "There's something else you should know about the night your father was admitted," he said. "The security logs from the Callaway building, the originals before Grant had them wiped, show a vehicle registered to an Ashford Holdings subsidiary in the parking structure adjacent to the building at 4:47 in the morning. Your father's car was found at 5:12. The hospital admission was at 5:58. He set the hard drive on the table with the deliberate care of someone placing evidence rather than an object. The medical examiner's report listed spontaneous hemorrhagic event. The case was closed in 36 hours. Grant signed the authorization to transfer the Callaway Systems assets to Ashford Holdings on the morning of the funeral. The room was very quiet again. Nora had believed for 12 years that her father had died of a stroke. She had believed it because the medical record said so, because the timing had been terrible, but not impossible. Walter Callaway had been under enormous professional stress, had been working 17-hour days, had refused to reduce his schedule despite her requests, and because the alternative was a thought that a person could not hold and continue to function. She was 30 years old when he died. She had been 31 when she married Grant, who had stood at the funeral and held her hand and told her that her father had built something extraordinary and that his legacy was safe. She sat very still for a moment. Then she looked at Fletcher and said, "How long will it take you to get that drive authenticated? I have a forensic contact in D.C. who can have a chain of custody declaration by Friday. Then we have Friday." She stood up from the kitchen table with the deliberate movement of someone who has identified the next step and has no time to spend on steps that are not the next one. "But there's a conversation I need to have first. Before Friday, before any of the evidentiary work, there's a call I need to make." Fletcher looked at her. "Who?" She moved to the window and looked down at the street below. A woman was walking a dog in the yellow circle of a street lamp, the dog investigating the base of a fire hydrant with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence. The rest of the block was quiet. "Grant has been married before," Nora said. "His first wife, Vivian Hargrove. She was the one who built the Back Bay real estate operation before he pushed her out and took the portfolio. She was supposed to be finished. He told the press she was finished." She paused. "She's been buying Ashford Holdings stock through a series of individual trust accounts for the last 15 years. I know because I spent 4 months looking for anyone in his past who might have had the same experience I was having, and Vivian Hargrove was the only one who had the resources, the intelligence, and the patience to do something about it." The street light outside made a small adjustment, or the night did, and the room shifted slightly around her. "She told me to find the key," Nora said. 3 months ago at a conference. She gave me a number to call when I did. I called it this morning." Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "And," Nora turned from the window, "and she said she's been ready for 18 years. She just needed someone to walk through the front door." On the television set in the apartment above, someone laughed at something. The sound came through the ceiling, muffled and remote, as though it belonged to a different story entirely. Nora picked up the manila envelope. She picked up the transcribed journal entry. She picked up her phone and looked at the time, 11:52 at night, 9.5 hours after a gavel had come down in a marble courtroom and the world had concluded incorrectly that she had nothing left. "The board meeting is in 12 days, she said. "But there's a charity gala at the Plaza Hotel this Saturday. Ashford Holdings Annual. 2,000 guests, open bar, and a display in the third-floor archive room that includes every piece of legacy hardware from the Callaway financial acquisition." She looked at Fletcher. "Including the original server my father used to build, Ledger, which is still running, which my father set a startup password on that Grant's people tried to crack for 3 years before they gave up and left the hardware in a display case as a piece of corporate mythology." She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "Grant thinks that server is a museum piece. He thinks it's decorative." She put on the coat. "He forgot," she said, "that the person who knows the password is still alive." The cab she had called was already at the curb by the time she reached the street. She did not look up at the courthouse, which was several miles north and across a river and had no visible presence in the Queen's night. But she felt the distance between this moment and the one in which she had stood before a judge and said that the judgment was acceptable, and she felt it not as loss, but as inventory, a careful accounting of what remained, which turned out to be considerably more than anyone watching had understood. The transfer document was in her pocket. The journal entry was folded against it. The morning of the gala was 4 days away. She got into the cab. "Where to?" The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror, his face illuminated in the dashboard light. "Westchester," Nora said. "I need to visit my father's workshop." The cab moved out into the quiet street, and the city closed behind it, the way a curtain closes after a first act, not with finality but with the particular expectation of what comes next. Nora left the workshop before 5 on Wednesday morning. She had slept on her father's cot for 3 hours. Not well, not badly. The specific sleep of someone whose mind has organized itself around a fixed point and is resting only because the body requires it. The October dark outside the workshop windows had the particular density of the hours before any light exists, and she had lain on the narrow cot listening to the building settle around her and thinking about the document she had found under the false drawer bottom and about the man who had hidden it there and about what it meant that he had trusted the hiding place to outlast him. She folded the cot blanket, left the workshop exactly as she had found it, drove back through Queens long enough to pack a bag, and was on the highway before 6. By 9, she was on Boylston Street in Back Bay, parking in a garage 2 blocks from the building Vivian owned outright, the converted textile warehouse that smelled of old brick and linseed oil, and the particular confidence of a woman who had bought the property when everyone else called the price aggressive and had simply been correct. Vivian was already at her desk. She had coffee ready as promised. She looked Nora over with the unhurried attention of someone whose assessments have been consistently accurate for 40 years. "Workshop floor," she said, not asking. "Your father kept a cot for the long nights. He slept there more than at the house toward the end." Nora sat down and accepted the coffee. "I think he knew something was coming and didn't want to bring it home." Vivian did not respond to this immediately. She looked at the manila envelope Nora placed on the desk between them, and she did not reach for it. "Tell me what's on the drive first," she said, and Nora told her the security logs, the vehicle registered to an Ashford Holdings subsidiary, the 90-minute window, the medical examiner's report closed in 36 hours, the authorization Grant had signed on the morning of the funeral. Vivian listened the way she did everything completely without interruption, attending to the parts the speaker almost didn't say. When Nora finished, Vivian looked at the whiteboard along the eastern wall, a grid of figures and dates that Nora recognized immediately as a shareholding structure, and then back at the envelope. "He had Walter killed," she said, not a question. "The logs place his asset in position. The timeline is consistent. My father's journal entry from the night before confirms Grant knew exactly what Walter was going to say." Nora's voice was level. Being level about it was the only way she could be useful about it. "I can't prove criminal intent from what I have alone. What I can prove, combined with the ledger data and the fraudulent patent filings, is a federal case significant enough that the people I've spoken to believe a grand jury would indict within 60 days. "Who have you spoken to?" "The number you gave me. The one you said to call when I found the key." Something moved in Vivian's face, not surprise, but the expression of someone watching a plan arrive at a stage they had imagined many times and not entirely believed they would live to see. "Special Agent Dara Winslow. She's been building the financial fraud case for 11 months. She had the transaction patterns. She didn't have documentation connecting them to intent." Nora paused. "She has it now." Vivian stood and went to the whiteboard. She picked up a marker, drew a clean vertical line down the center of the grid, and wrote 2 numbers, 11.2% on the left, 13.2% on the right. "I have enough voting shares to call an emergency special meeting and introduce a motion to halt any pending acquisition pending independent audit," she said. "Under Section 14 of the Ashford Holdings Charter, 12% is the threshold. I'm at 13.3. She capped the marker. "The gala is Saturday. We file the Section 14 petition Friday morning with 72 hours notice. The meeting falls Monday." She turned around. "But I need what's on that server before I file. Without the ledger data, the audit motion has no teeth. He'll contest it, delay it, bury it in litigation for 2 years. "The gala is Saturday," Nora said. "The archive room on the 3rd floor has the original Callaway server. Grant's team tried to crack the startup sequence for 3 years. They left it in a display case when they couldn't." She set down her coffee. "The password is mine. My father made sure of that." Vivian studied her for a long moment, the specific attention of someone who has spent 17 years building toward a moment and is now determining whether the person in front of her is the variable she has been waiting for. Then she sat back down. "I can get you into the gala as a Hargrove Foundation guest. That gets you access to the archive room with a legitimate credential. Documented attendance, no questions." She paused. "But I need you to understand something about how I'm positioned in this." "Tell me." I have been purchasing Ashford Holdings stock for 11 years through 14 separate trust accounts, Vivian said. No two registered under the same name. No single account over 1.3%. Grant's compliance team has never connected them to me. She looked at the whiteboard. I built this position the morning after he sat across a table from me and told my own attorneys that my contribution to the Back Bay portfolio had been administrative in nature. He had restructured the holding company 4 months earlier in a way my attorneys failed to catch. I lost everything I had spent 17 years building. I was 53 years old. Her voice did not change in register, but something behind it did, the compression of 11 years of specific sustained purpose finding its first full expression. I decided that afternoon I was going to take it back, not the properties, the record. I want every person who shook his hand at a charity gala and called him a visionary to read the word fraud in the same sentence as his name in every financial publication in this country. The room was quiet for a moment except for the building, the sounds of a very old structure maintained carefully settling into itself a faint suggestion of wind against brick. But I needed someone who had what I couldn't get from the outside, Vivian said. Someone with access to ledger, someone with legal standing. She picked up her coffee. I gave you that number 3 months ago because I had been watching you for 2 years, and you were the only person in this situation who understood what your father actually built. Nora looked at the numbers on the whiteboard. 11 years of patience rendered as percentages. The gala is Saturday, she said again. We have 3 days. Fletcher was in the lobby when Nora came down at 11:40. He had driven up separately, arriving an hour after her, and had spent the intervening time in a coffee shop across the street with a laptop and the focused inactivity of investigators who have spent decades learning that the right moment to move is rarely the first one available. He fell into step beside her on Boylston Street without preamble. Forensic authentication came through this morning. His voice was low and level-pitched for the distance between them and not for the couple 15 feet ahead. Chain of custody declaration, time-stamped provenance. Winslow has a copy. He paused. There's something else. I ran the subsidiary registration for the vehicle in the parking structure logs. Shell Company, Delaware, 3 layers of beneficial ownership. The ultimate controlling entity is a trust called the Marlowe Family Holding Trust, established 2007. Tessa Marlowe. Her father's originally. She inherited control 6 years ago. She would have been 26 when your father was killed. He let that sit for a moment. Young to be managing that instrument. But I don't think she was being directed. I think she was a partner. 26 years old and very capable, and Grant found exactly the right use for both. They reached the corner and waited for the light. The Boston morning had moved from overcast to something more decisive. The sky pressing down gray and purposeful. The wind off the water carrying the specific chill of New England October. Not the polite cold of early autumn, but the first real announcement of what was coming. She designed the acquisition structure, Fletcher said. Every holding vehicle, every beneficial ownership layer, every compliance filing. Grant's name is on the signature lines because he has the profile, the board relationships, the press access, the track record. She built what he's signing. The light changed. They crossed. Which means when the case breaks, Nora said, he'll move to position her as the primary liability. Already happening. Fletcher showed her his phone, a screenshot of an email chain forwarded by a contact in a D.C. attorney's office. Grant's lead outside counsel discussing the Marlowe Family Holding Trust in the context of establishing a principal-agent distinction in the acquisition structure. 6 weeks of quiet repositioning. She probably doesn't know how far along it is. Nora handed the phone back. She thought about her father at the workbench. A structure is only as reliable as its foundation, and about Grant, who had spent a decade building something impressive on ground he did not own and had apparently not understood until too late that the ground itself was the variable. The Plaza Hotel on a Saturday evening in mid-October operated at the particular frequency of New York's charitable machinery running at full capacity, the chandeliered rooms filling steadily with people who understood that being seen giving was professionally equivalent to giving, who moved through the cocktail hour with the ease of those for whom this was not an occasion but a working environment. Nora arrived at 7:15 as N. Callaway Hargrove Foundation guest credential, documented and legitimate exactly as she had wanted it. She wore the steel blue dress, the color of her father's Oxford shirts, the ones her mother had bought in multiples because Walter Calloway misplaced individual things but never lost a habit. She had not chosen the color deliberately. She had pulled it from the closet in Queens and held it for a moment before putting it on, and the recognition had arrived quietly the way certain recognitions do. Some choices are made before you know you're making them. The ballroom announced itself before she entered it, the low-layered sound of 1,800 people in formal conversation, the orchestra placing a waltz beneath the noise like a structural element rather than a decoration, strings and brass, and the rhythmic undertow of a bass line that the crowd absorbed without registering. Through the doors came the scent of hothouse flowers and expensive candles, and the faint metallic edge of air conditioning working against too many bodies in a climate-controlled space. Inside, the lighting was warm enough to be flattering, and the champagne arrived with the calibrated frequency of a system designed to sustain goodwill through the duration of an ask. Nora moved through the ballroom as she had moved through 200 events, like it over 10 years of marriage, with the ease of someone for whom the environment was familiar and the purpose was not social. She had learned in those 200 events to read a room by its edges rather than its center. The people who actually held power were never at the center. They were the ones moving along the perimeter, gathering information, making the calculations that would matter after the champagne was gone. She had spent a decade watching those people from the wrong side of the room. Fletcher was positioned near the south corridor entrance, running cable with the professional unhaste of a contractor whose job requires him to be in many places and draw attention in none of them. They did not make eye contact. The third-floor archive room was accessible from a service corridor off the main elevator bank, and at 7:45 during the second cocktail pass, when room density made individual movement unremarkable, Nora moved toward it. The corridor outside the ballroom was a different acoustic world. The click of her heels on marble carrying sharp and clean after the absorbed warmth of the crowd, the orchestral waltz reduced to a murmur behind closed doors, the ventilation system audible now in the way it never was over conversation. She badged through the archive access point past a guard who checked her credential with the automated attention of someone performing a function rather than making a decision, and stepped into the quiet of the third floor. The archive room displayed Ashford Holdings' corporate history in chronological sequence along its walls. At the far end, under climate-controlled glass on a low platform, sat the Callaway Financial Systems server, matte black, 18 inches wide, 36 inches tall, her father's handwriting on the front panel tag, Ledger version 1. Prototype. The display placard identified it as an early internal development tool. The name Callaway did not appear anywhere in the room. She knelt behind the platform and found the maintenance access panel, the same one she had watched her father open 100 times in the workshop. The latch mechanism was unchanged. She plugged Fletcher's drive into the retrofitted USB port, an upgrade her father had added in 2002, noted by Grant's technical team and not understood, and the embedded screen activated asking for the startup sequence. The password was her birthday written in reverse order, month and day, transposed the way her father had always written dates in a hurry, a habit from a graduate school professor that had never left him. She entered it. The system accepted it. 43%, 61%. Interesting equipment. The voice came from the doorway. Nora did not move or look up. She recognized it, heard it at the courthouse on Tuesday, and in various social contexts over 3 years, always positioned carefully, always in the register of someone who had learned to be present without being locatable. Tessa Marlowe spoke with the precision of someone educated across multiple professional registers who had chosen as her default something that sounded like curiosity and was structured like assessment. 78%. Legacy hardware runs warm, Nora said. Her posture was that of someone performing routine maintenance. Enclosed spaces. That unit hasn't had maintenance since it was installed in this room. Tessa had moved further in, deliberate and unhurried. I reviewed the archive records 6 months ago, and your badge is a Hargrove Foundation guest credential, not contractor. 91%. I've known who you are since Tuesday morning, Tessa said. Her voice had shifted the professional register, thinning toward something less managed. I watched you accept that verdict. People who are actually defeated don't accept verdicts that cleanly. They contest, they appeal, they perform the loss for the cameras. A pause. My question isn't what you're doing here. My question is whether you already know what Grant is doing to me. 97%, 100, the drive ejected. Nora stood and faced Tessa Marlowe directly for the first time. No courtroom, no crowd, no managed distance between them. What she saw was a woman of 36 who had built something she was beginning to understand she might not be permitted to keep. "I know about the documentation restructuring," Nora said. "I know about the principal agent repositioning. His outside counsel has been building a structure for 6 weeks that places the Marlowe Family Holding Trust on the primary liability side of the acquisition." The expression that moved across Tessa's face occupied the space between recognition and the thing that comes just before it, someone watching a conclusion they have been avoiding arrive with the unhurried certainty of weather. "He told me the trust layering was protective," Tessa said. "Standard practice for transactions of this size, insulation for both of us." "It insulates him," Nora said. "It positions you." The room was quiet. Below them, distantly, the master of ceremonies establishing the evening's charitable stakes, the ballroom responding with the warmth of people on their second glass. Tessa looked at the server, then at the drive in Nora's hand, then at her. The ledger logs, if the background mode has been running since installation, every anomalous transaction routed through any Callaway-connected system for 11 years is documented, Nora said, including the ones that funded the shell structure your trust was used to hold. The silence between them had the specific quality of a room in which information has just changed the geometry of every available decision. "I want to talk to the federal contact," Tessa said. "Whatever cooperation framework is on the table before Monday. You have until 4 Saturday morning. That's when the DOJ window closes on the current terms. After that, the structure changes." Nora moved toward the door. "Vivian Hargrove can connect you with the right attorneys tonight." She left the archive room, walked the service corridor back to the elevator bank, and found Fletcher at the south entrance coiling cable. "Done," she said. "Grant's personal detail is looking for someone matching a description that isn't quite you." Fletcher kept coiling. "Close enough to mean he knows you're in the building. Then we have 40 minutes before his speech." She had not been wrong about any of the shapes of the room, the shapes of the people in it, the shape of what would happen when information moved through the right channels at the right speed. Her father had taught her to read structure before surface, to understand what a system was actually doing before accepting what it claimed to be doing, to trust that correct things held. Grant had built a decade of careful architecture on a foundation he had never owned. He had believed that removing her name from documents was the same as removing her from the equation. He had never understood that her name had never been the variable he should have been watching. They moved toward the exit. 2 security men in event jackets stepped from the elevator behind them and looked in the wrong direction, and the October night outside received them without ceremony, indifferent, wide, full of the particular quality of a city that does not pause for any single story, regardless of how long it has been building. The board meeting was in 9 days. In her pocket, a drive containing 11 years of her father's quiet, patient, irrefutable truth. In her chest, the specific gravity of someone who has just crossed from the long preparation into the short execution, and who understands that the distance between those 2 phases is not measured in time, but in commitment, the moment you stop planning and simply move, trusting the architecture to hold. She had been trusting it since the morning she found the document under the false drawer bottom. It had been holding since 1999. Tessa Marlowe signed the cooperation agreement at 3:47 in the morning in the back office of a law firm on Lexington Avenue whose senior partner owed Vivian Hargrove a favor of the kind that does not appear in billing records. The document ran to 22 pages. The attorney representing Tessa, a woman named Carol Fitch, who had spent 16 years doing white-collar defense before moving to cooperation work, read every page twice while Tessa sat across the table in the same clothes she had worn to the gala, the silk carrying the particular exhaustion of formal wear that has lasted past its occasion. Nora was not in the room. She was in the hallway outside on a bench that had been placed there for the kind of waiting that legal proceedings generate, drinking coffee from a paper cup that had gone cold 30 minutes ago. Fletcher sat beside her. They had developed over the preceding 9 days the economy of people working toward a single fixed point, who have agreed without discussing it to conserve everything that is not essential to reaching it. Vivian emerged at 3:52 and sat in the chair across from the bench. She looked for the first time in Nora's experience of her like someone who had been awake for a very long time, not diminished by it, but marked. There is a difference between exhaustion and intensity, and what Vivian carried was the latter, worn to the edge of the former. She gave them everything. Vivian's voice was precise, unhurried. The full acquisition structure, every holding vehicle, the communication logs between her and Grant going back 4 years. There are recordings. She made them herself starting 18 months ago when she noticed the documentation restructuring and didn't yet know what it meant, but knew enough to know she should have evidence of her own instructions received. Fletcher looked at the ceiling. She protected herself before she knew she needed protecting. She is considerably smarter than he gave her credit for. Vivian looked at Nora. Most people are. Nora looked at the clock on the wall, a round institutional clock, the kind that moves in visible increments, each second its own discrete announcement. 4 hours and 9 minutes until the Ashford Holdings emergency shareholder meeting, which Vivian's attorneys had formally convened 72 hours earlier under Section 14 of the corporate charter, filing the petition with 13.3% of voting shares attached, and the agenda item listed in the careful language such documents require, as a motion to halt pending acquisitions and initiate an independent audit of all intellectual property ownership claims associated with the ledger system and its derivative architectures. Grant's attorneys had filed 3 separate objections. All 3 had been denied by 9 o'clock the previous morning. The meeting was at 8. It would happen whether Grant wanted it to or not. Nora stood and dropped the cold coffee in the trash. "Call me at 6, she said, and went to find somewhere to sleep. Vivian's Back Bay office had a couch that could accommodate a person of average height if they did not object to their feet hanging slightly over the armrest. Nora slept on it for 88 minutes, which was not enough, and was sufficient, and woke 2 minutes before Fletcher called at 6. She washed her face in the office bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror with the attention of someone taking inventory, rather than making an assessment, cataloging what is present, what it has been through, what it needs to do in the next 4 hours. She had brought 1 change of clothes to Boston. A dark suit purchased 6 weeks ago that had hung in the closet in Queens waiting to be worn. She had looked at it the night before when she was packing and thought about what it communicated: preparation control, the kind of polished presentation that the financial world rewarded, and she had left it on the hanger. She put the steel blue dress back on. It was wrinkled from a night of movement and a morning of legal proceedings. It was the color of her father's Oxford shirts, the ones her mother had bought in bulk because Walter Calloway lost individual things but never lost the habit of the color. She had not chosen it consciously when she packed it 3 days ago. Some decisions are made before you know you are making them. Fletcher appeared in the office doorway at 6:15 with coffee that was actually hot. Vivian was already at her desk working the phone with the focused efficiency of someone for whom 4 hours of sleep is a professional norm. She had spoken, Nora gathered from the half of the conversation audible from across the room, with 3 separate institutional investors whose positions in Ashford Holdings ranged from 0.8 to 2.3%, each of whom had questions about the audit motion, and each of whom Vivian answered with the calm authority of someone whose homework goes 17 layers deeper than the question being asked. At 6:45, Vivian ended the last call and looked at Nora across the desk. "Special Agent Winslow will be in position by 7:30. She set her phone down with the deliberateness of someone completing one phase and beginning another. Her team has the cooperation agreement, the full ledger data package, and the authenticated security logs. The arrest warrant was signed at 11 o'clock last night." A pause. "They are waiting for the meeting. Winslow wants the public record, the shareholder floor, the formal presentation, the board's response captured in the official minutes. She said it closes evidentiary gaps in the fraud case if the misrepresentations about ledger ownership are made explicitly in a formal corporate proceeding in front of witnesses whose attendance is documented. She wants him to say it out loud in front of 2,000 people and a stenographer," Fletcher said. 2,200, Vivian said without inflection. Nora picked up the manila envelope from the desk where she had left it the previous morning. The notarized transfer was inside the original, not a copy, because the original was what would be placed in front of the board. She had also printed in the clean format of a legal exhibit the chain of custody documentation for the ledger data package, the authenticated security logs from the Callaway Financial Building, and the first 40 pages of the transaction record that Ledger had been compiling since 1999. The full document ran to more than 3,000 pages. It represented 11 years of a dead man's foresight. The dead man's switch her father had built into a system he had understood from the beginning might outlast his ability to protect it in person. She held the envelope and did not think about the meeting or the warrant or the 2,200 people who would be in that room in 90 minutes. She thought about Walter Calloway at 4 in the morning in a workshop in Westchester, building something that would tell the truth when he could not. Then she put on her coat and walked toward the door. The Ashford Holdings building on 6th Avenue was 43 stories of glass and steel, completed in 2009, its facade the recipient of 2 architectural awards, and its lobby atrium the recipient of 1 industry citation for the honeycomb of angled panels that admitted morning light in a way that Grant had commissioned because he had read that natural light improved employee productivity and had wanted a measurable return on the aesthetic investment. The shareholder meeting was held on the 38th floor in a room the company called the Grand Conference Suite, which could seat with the temporary chairs the facilities team had arranged approximately 2,200 people. Nora had attended this meeting every year of her marriage. She had attended as the CEO's wife, which was a role with significant social requirements and no operational authority, and she had sat in the front row of the guest section and listened to Grant present the annual performance review with the fluent confidence of a man who had long since stopped distinguishing between what he believed and what he needed his audience to believe. She had listened carefully. She had been trained before the marriage to listen to the architecture of things, the load-bearing elements, the places where a structure was relying on something that might not hold. She had heard over 10 years of annual meetings a great deal that did not hold. She did not enter through the main lobby. She came through the building's service entrance on the side street, credentialed by the same contractor badge Fletcher had arranged, and rode the freight elevator to the 37th floor and walked up 1 flight of stairs to the anteroom adjacent to the Grand Conference Suite. Fletcher was already there, laptop connected to the suite's presentation system through an access point the building's AV team had established for contractor use, and that Grant's security detail had not thought to revoke because the contractor credentials were legitimate, and because the security detail was focused on the main entrance where shareholders were filing in under the particular energy of people who have received a Section 14 petition and traveled to witness its consequences. At 7:58, Vivian entered the Grand Conference Suite, through the main door, walked to the reserved shareholder section in the 3rd row, and placed her credential on the armrest in the visible way of someone establishing their right to be present. She had brought 2 attorneys, both of whom sat beside her with the composed readiness of people who have reviewed the relevant charter provisions and found them unambiguous. At 8 o'clock, Grant Ashford walked onto the stage. He wore a suit the color of deep water and the charcoal silk tie with the diagonal grain. He looked precisely as he always looked on this stage, measured, prepared, carrying the relaxed authority of a man for whom the size of a room has become an amenity rather than a pressure. He did not see Nora. She was not yet visible. The meeting opened with procedural formalities, quorum confirmation, approval of previous minutes, acknowledgement of the agenda. Grant's general counsel moved through the procedural items with professional efficiency. The institutional investors who had come specifically because of the Section 14 petition sat in the kind of attentive stillness that precedes a moment they have traveled to witness. Grant moved to the strategic overview at 8:14. Revenues, margins, the expansion of the managed services division, the licensing revenue generated by the Ledger system. He described Ledger as he always described it, as the foundational asset of the Ashford Holdings intellectual property portfolio developed through the vision and sustained investment of the company's technical teams over more than a decade. He did not mention Walter Calloway. He had not mentioned Walter Calloway in any public statement about Ledger since 2013. At 8:27 he moved to the acquisition announcement. He described it in the careful language of a transaction whose terms were not yet fully disclosed, a significant expansion of the Ledger licensing architecture through a strategic partnership representing the most substantial monetization of the company's core intellectual property in its history. This transaction, Grant said, his voice carrying the register of someone delivering the conclusion of a long argument, represents the full realization of the value we have built in this system over more than a decade, the value your investment has supported, the value that has always been, the value that was never yours to monetize. The words came through the room's PA system at exactly the volume of the room's amplification, reaching every corner of the Grand Conference Suite with equal clarity. Grant stopped mid-sentence. The doors at the rear of the conference suite opened. Nora walked in. She was aware of the reaction, the way you are aware of weather, not by looking at it directly, but by the way it changes the atmosphere around you, the pressure shift of 2,200 people redirecting their attention simultaneously. She did not look at the room. She looked at the stage and she walked toward it at the pace of someone who has decided on a direction and has no remaining questions about it. Fletcher had kept the audio routing live. Her voice carried without a microphone. "The ledger system was designed and built by Walter James Calloway," she said. "The original architecture, the core encryption protocols, the background transaction logging that has been running continuously in your systems for 11 years. All of it was created by my father in a workshop in Westchester before this company existed in its current form. The patent was filed under Calloway Financial Systems. The transfer to Ashford Holdings was executed through a series of fraudulent filings that misrepresented the ownership structure and excluded the joint holder whose signature was required for any valid transfer." Grant's voice came through the podium microphone. "This is my former wife. As many of you know, she has been under considerable psychological. I have the original notarized transfer of ownership," Nora said, continuing at the same pace through the same sentence, "signed by my father on the morning he died. I have the chain of custody authentication for 11 years of ledger background transaction logs that document every anomalous transfer routed through this company's systems during that period. And I have, through the cooperation of someone who helped architect this acquisition and has since provided full testimony to federal prosecutors, recordings of conversations in which the fraudulent nature of the patent transfer was discussed in explicit terms." She reached the stage stairs. She walked up them and stood on the stage, not at the podium 6 feet to Grant's left, and looked at him across the distance that remained between them, which was not very much, and was in every way that had ever mattered enormous. She looked at the room. 2,200 faces, cameras, the stenographer at the small desk to the right of the stage, whose fingers had not stopped moving since Nora began speaking. "Show them," she said, and Fletcher pressed enter. The presentation screen behind Grant went dark for 2 seconds. Then it filled with the notarized transfer of ownership, legible at the screen's scale the signatures of Walter James Calloway and Nora Marie Calloway, visible in the lower right quadrant, the notary seal beside them, the date and the timestamp showing 7:43 in the morning on the day Walter Calloway was admitted to Mercy General Hospital and never came home. The room's silence had weight. The particular density of a large number of people processing something that requires them to revise a significant number of prior assumptions simultaneously. Grant moved toward the podium controls. Fletcher had disabled the local override from the anteroom at 7:59. Grant's hands found nothing that worked. The screen changed. The chain of custody declaration, the forensic authentication, the independent examiner's declaration of provenance. The screen changed again. 40 pages of transaction log, the first 40 of more than 3,000 with dates and amounts and account numbers that told in the dry and irrefutable language of financial data. The story of 11 years of transfers through vehicles that were not supposed to exist, recorded automatically by a system designed by a man who understood concealment, built to make concealment the most expensive choice available. The screen changed one final time. Audio only, the visual, a static waveform against a dark background. Grant's voice clear and unambiguous in a conversation Tessa Marlowe had recorded 14 months ago when she had begun to understand the geometry of what was being built around her. The recording covered the fraudulent nature of the patent transfer, the deliberate exclusion of Nora Calloway from the ownership documentation, and a specific discussion of Walter Calloway's impending grand jury testimony and the measures taken to prevent it. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Every word captured by a woman who had been smart enough to understand before she understood everything else that she needed to be able to prove what she had been told to do. When the recording ended, the room was completely still. Then from the side entrance of the conference suite, 4 people entered: 2 federal agents, an attorney from the United States Attorney's Office, and Special Agent Dara Winslow, who had been working this case for 11 months, and who walked to the foot of the stage stairs and looked up at Grant Ashford with the expression of someone who has arrived at a specific moment exactly on schedule. "Grant Ashford." Her voice was level and carried without effort. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy in connection with the death of Walter James Calloway." The sound that followed was not what the room expected of itself. It was not chaos. It was the sound of 2,200 people exhaling at the same moment the acoustic release of a pressure that had been building inside a system designed from the beginning to hold the truth until someone arrived to claim it. Grant looked at Nora. His face had moved through several states in the preceding 8 minutes and had arrived at something she had not fully anticipated. Not rage, not calculation, but a specific vacancy. The expression of a man whose operating assumptions have been so completely invalidated that the machinery of the face has stopped receiving instructions. "You accepted the verdict." His voice was low. "You walked out of that courtroom with nothing." She looked at him steadily. "I walked out with everything I needed. You never understood what I was carrying because you were watching for the things you would have done." She reached into the envelope and placed the notarized transfer on the podium between them, the original, her father's signature, in the lower right, the date of the morning he died. "You removed my name from every filing. You spent 3 years trying to break a password on a server that had already recorded everything you were doing." She stepped back from the podium. "The system was always going to tell the truth. My father built it that way. He built it for exactly this." The federal agents came up the stage stairs. The handcuffs were applied with the procedural efficiency of people performing a familiar function, and the room watched it happen with the complete attention of 2,200 witnesses who understood, in the way that people understand things they will remember for the rest of their lives, the precise distance between the story they had been told and the story that was true. Nora did not watch him leave the stage. She picked up the manila envelope, the transfer document still inside it because the podium copy was a duplicate she had prepared for exactly this placement, and walked down the stage stairs and up the center aisle toward the rear of the conference suite. The room on either side of her was beginning to find its voice, the low initial sound of a large space returning to itself after something significant has moved through it. Vivian fell into step beside her at the third row without a word. Fletcher met them at the rear doors. The three of them walked into the corridor, and the doors closed behind them, and the noise of the room continued on the other side, swelling and organizing itself into the particular register of people who have just witnessed something they will spend a long time trying to describe accurately. The corridor was quiet. The morning light came through the east-facing windows in the particular way of October light, low and direct, without apology. Nora stopped walking. She stood for a moment with the envelope in her hands and looked at the light on the floor, and the grief that had been waiting in the organized spaces of her chest, the grief she had been precise about, that she had kept functional and contained because she could not afford it to be otherwise, arrived without announcement and moved through her in the specific way of things that have been waiting a long time for permission. She did not cry. She stood very still and felt the full weight of it and did not look away from it, and after a moment that lasted longer than its clock measurement, she raised her head and looked at Fletcher and Vivian. Fletcher was watching her with the expression of someone who has learned through his own version of this that the correct response to another person's grief is simply to remain present and not fill the silence with something smaller than what it contains. Vivian reached out and put one hand on Nora's arm. She did not say anything. She was a woman who understood that certain moments are not improved by language. After a while, Nora said, "He built a dead man's switch into the software. He encrypted everything and left the password where only I would find it, and trusted that the architecture would hold until I came looking." She looked at the envelope. "He didn't know if I would find it. He didn't know if it would be enough. He just built it correctly and trusted that correct things hold." She looked up at the light on the corridor wall. "I want to go to the workshop," she said. The workshop in Westchester was exactly as it had always been. The corrugated metal roof, the walls her father had insulated himself, the smell of machine oil and old paper, and something that was specific to the particular chemistry of decades of precise work done in a contained space. The workbench along the east wall. The stool where she had sat at 9 years old with a cup of hot chocolate at her elbow, learning that architecture was logic made physical and everything else was decoration. She sat on that stool for a long time without doing anything. Fletcher and Vivian had stayed in the car at the end of the driveway. Vivian had not asked why Nora needed to come here, which was one of the things about Vivian that Nora had come to depend on. The people worth keeping are the ones who understand what not to ask. She opened her father's journal to the last entry. She had read it many times. She read it again now in the workshop where he had written it, and for the first time she read it at the pace of the handwriting rather than the pace of urgency, which was the pace he had intended. The entry ended. "I don't know if this will be enough. I built the system to be honest even if I can't be present. That's all I know how to do. Make something that tells the truth and trust it to last." She closed the journal and set it on the workbench beside the stool. The light through the east window was the late morning light of October, and it fell across the workbench at an angle that she recognized without having consciously noted it, before the same angle at which her father had positioned the lamp on nights when he worked past dark, because he had believed that the quality of the light affected the quality of the thinking, and he had never stopped believing in the value of attending to the conditions under which you do the work that matters. She thought about what it meant to be raised by a person who built things correctly and trusted them to last. She thought about the 10 years she had spent inside a structure designed to make her believe she was a decoration rather than a load-bearing element, and how the dismantling of that belief had not happened in a courtroom or on a stage in front of 2,000 people, but here on a stool in a workshop in Westchester, reading a dead man's handwriting at the pace he had intended. She sat with it until the sitting was finished. Then she stood up, put the journal in the envelope with the transfer document, and walked out of the workshop into the October air. The sentencing was 7 months later. Grant Ashford received 38 years securities fraud, carrying the full weight of the federal guidelines. Obstruction of justice compounding the baseline, and the homicide charge prosecuted by the Manhattan DA on the basis of the authenticated security logs, the ledger transaction records, and Tessa Marlowe's complete testimony, resulting in a first-degree murder conviction that the judge described in her statement as reflecting a deliberate and premeditated disregard for human life in the service of financial gain. Tessa received 9 years. Her cooperation had been complete and her testimony had been specific, and the judge acknowledged both. She had also provided, without additional negotiation, 2 supplementary pieces of evidence the prosecution had not requested. Nora's attorney noted this was unusual. Nora thought it was the behavior of someone who had decided that the only foundation worth building on was the one that could be acknowledged in daylight. Renata Oakes had her CPA certification restored 11 days after the arrest, following a state licensing board review that took considerably less time than the fraudulent complaint had taken to process. Fletcher was present at the hearing. He sat in the back row and did not speak. His daughter walked out of the building and he met her on the steps, and the conversation they had there was not witnessed by anyone, which was correct. The company was renamed. The board proposed several options, and Nora reviewed them and expressed her preference, once clearly Callaway Financial Group. The vote was unanimous. The signage on the 6th Avenue building was changed within the month. Vivian's 14 trust accounts were consolidated into a single disclosed position 3 weeks after the arrest. Her attorneys filed the disclosure paperwork with the precision of someone who has been waiting a long time to make a particular fact public and wants the documentation to be unambiguous. She did not attend the press conference the company held to announce the restructured ownership. She sent Nora a card that said in Vivian's spare handwriting, "Well done. Now run it correctly." Nora kept the card on the desk in the office she occupied on the 38th floor of the Callaway Financial Group building, the office that had been set up for her with the neutral caution of people uncertain about a new employer's preferences, and that she had made her own in the specific way of someone who understands that a space takes on the meaning of what is done in it. The manila envelope was on the desk. She had carried it every day since the workshop in Westchester, and she set it there now, not with the deliberateness of ceremony, but with the ordinary finality of an object arriving at the place it belongs. Inside the notarized transfer, the journal, and the re-registered ledger patent listing both names in the ownership field, Walter James Callaway and Nora Marie Callaway, processed by a patent attorney who had said, reviewing the original filing, that whoever had drafted it had understood precisely what they were doing. Her father had understood precisely what he was doing. He had always understood. He had built a system that told the truth when he could not, and hidden a document where his daughter would eventually look, and done both of these things in the hours before he drove toward a courthouse he would not reach, because he had understood that the architecture he had built was more durable than his ability to defend it in person, and that the most important quality of a structure, the quality that determines whether it lasts, is not its visibility, but its integrity. Fletcher knocked on the open door at 9:05. He was dressed in a suit that fit him properly, which was a recent development, and he looked like someone who had set down a weight that had been distributed so evenly across his body for so long that he had forgotten it was there until the day it was gone. "Board's ready," he said. "Vivian reorganized the seating chart. Tell her the seating chart is fine. She knows. She reorganized it anyway." Nora picked up the envelope from the desk, not because she needed it in the meeting, because she was not yet ready to leave it in a room where she was not, and she understood that this was something she would grow out of gradually in the way that people grow out of the habits of vigilance that kept them alive during the period when vigilance was the only tool available. The day would come when she would leave the envelope on the desk and walk out the door and not think about it until she returned. That day was not today. Today she held it. She crossed to the window and looked out at the city Manhattan in the particular clarity of a cold October morning, the buildings sharp against a sky that had decided for once to be unambiguous. The light coming through the honeycomb panels in the lobby atrium below animated the hallway outside her office door in the way that well-planned light animates a space, making it feel inhabited rather than occupied. She thought about her father at 4 a.m. building something honest in the dark, trusting it to last. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one making the most noise. It is the one who understood the room before they ever walked in, who mapped its load-bearing elements and its weaknesses and its exits, and who waited with the patience of someone who has been taught that correct structures hold for the moment when understanding becomes action. Walter Calloway had built that kind of structure. He had built it in a workshop in Westchester, and he had hidden the key where only one person would think to look, and the system had run quietly in the background of every transaction for 11 years, accumulating the truth in the patient and unglamorous way that truth accumulates when it has been well designed, not announced, not celebrated, simply present, simply accurate, simply waiting. His daughter had found the key. She had done what he had trusted her to do, and now she was standing in the building that bore his name, holding an envelope that contained the proof of what he had built, about to walk into a room full of people who needed someone to show them how to run something correctly. She turned from the window. Fletcher was still in the doorway, patient in the way of someone who has learned that certain people need a moment and that the moment is worth waiting for. "Let's go," she said. She walked out the door, and the morning light that her father had never seen fell through the windows of the building that now carried his name, and it landed on the floor behind her and stayed there, doing what light does in a well-made space reaching as far as its design intended, no further and no less exactly enough.